There's a world inside you, vast, uncharted, and alive. It dreams while you're awake. It hides what you refuse to see. It speaks in symbols, not words, and if you listen carefully, it tells the truth. Carl Jung didn't just study the mind, he mapped the soul. He saw patterns behind the chaos, meaning behind suffering, and gold hidden in your shadow. These aren't just ideas, they are doorways to yourself. Tonight, let them guide you inward. This is a journey into the unconscious, one idea at a time. Carl Jung was a Swiss psychiatrist born in 1875. At first, he walked beside Freud, but quickly diverged, not content with just studying pathology. Jung went deeper. He believed the human psyche was not just shaped by childhood or trauma, but by myths, archetypes, and ancient patterns buried in the unconscious. Breathe, let go, and begin. Carl Jung believed that beneath the surface of every human mind exists something far older than the individual. The collective unconscious. It is not shaped by your personal experiences. Instead, it is inherited, a psychic blueprint that every human shares regardless of culture, time, or geography. While your personal unconscious is made up of forgotten memories and repressed feelings, the collective unconscious is different. It is impersonal. It holds universal patterns, symbols, and instincts. Jung called these archetypes that have existed in the human psyche for thousands of years. You see it in myths that repeat across civilizations that never met, in symbols that appear in dreams of people from different continents, in emotional responses that seem hardwired into us. Jung didn't believe the human mind was a blank slate. He believed we are born with a kind of inner architecture, a deep, inherited structure of meaning. The collective unconscious is the foundation for everything else that follows in his psychology. And it's from this vast and quiet layer of the mind that all his most important ideas begin to emerge. At the core of the collective unconscious are what Jung called archetypes, universal inherited templates that shape the way we perceive and respond to the world. They are not memories or specific ideas. They are deeper than that, more like patterns of energy or psychological instincts. They influence how we see ourselves, others, and life itself. You can think of archetypes like recurring characters in a story: the mother, the hero, the wise old man, the child, the trickster, the shadow. These figures show up again and again in mythology, religion, folklore, and dreams across every culture in history. They aren't created by society. They emerge from within. That's what makes them archetypal. You don't invent them. You discover them already living inside you. Archetypes are not fixed personalities. They are dynamic forces that express themselves differently depending on who you are, what you've lived through, and how conscious you've become. They can guide you, or they can control you. They can bring meaning, or they can bring chaos. Jung believed that to live a meaningful life, you must become aware of which archetypes are shaping you, and learn to relate to them rather than be possessed by them. Understanding archetypes means understanding yourself at a much deeper level. The shadow is one of the most important and most misunderstood ideas in Jung's psychology. It represents the parts of yourself that you reject, deny, or push away. Not just negative traits like anger, envy, or selfishness, but also positive aspects like power, confidence, or desire, if they don't fit the image you have of who you're supposed to be. The shadow forms unconsciously. It begins in childhood, when you're taught what is acceptable and what isn't. Everything that gets labeled as bad, unwanted, or shameful gets pushed out of your awareness, into the shadow. But it doesn't disappear, it just waits. It shows up in dreams, in moments of rage, in projection, where you see in others what you refuse to see in yourself. It leaks out in the ways you sabotage relationships, hold yourself back, or react without understanding why. Jung didn't believe the shadow should be destroyed. He believed it must be faced, not with judgment, but with curiosity. He said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. When you integrate your shadow, you become more whole, not perfect, but real. You reclaim energy that was trapped in repression. You gain clarity, depth, and strength. The shadow is not your enemy. It is simply the part of you waiting to be seen." Carl Jung believed that within every human psyche exists a counter-sexual archetype, a deep, unconscious inner image of the opposite sex. He called this the anima in men and the animus in women. The anima represents the unconscious feminine side of a man, the animus, the unconscious masculine side of a woman. But these aren't simply gender roles. They are psychological energies, emotional tendencies, ways of perceiving, intuitive forces shaped by both biology and cultural history. In a man, the anima may show up as moods, fantasies, deep sensitivities, or idealized images of women. She can appear in dreams as a guide or as a source of confusion and temptation. In a woman, the animus might appear as inner conviction, intellect, authority, or strong inner voices that push or criticize. If left unconscious, these archetypes can distort how we relate to the opposite sex. We may project them onto others, falling in love not with a real person, but with a fantasy created by the anima or animus. But if we recognize them, work with them, and integrate them, they become bridges to the deeper self. Jung saw this inner union between masculine and feminine energies as essential to psychological wholeness. We all carry both within us, and healing often begins with acknowledging the part of ourselves we've neglected or misunderstood. At the center of Jung's entire psychology is a process he called individuation. It is the journey of becoming whole, not perfect, but whole. It means integrating all the parts of yourself, the conscious and the unconscious, the light and the shadow, the persona and the true self, into a unified, balanced identity. Most people live from the surface of their personality. They identify with the ego, their job, their habits, their social image. But Jung believed that this is only a fragment of who you are. The real task of life is to discover what lies beneath and to bring it into consciousness. Individuation is not self-improvement. It's not about becoming someone else. It's about becoming yourself, the full, complex, authentic version of who you were always meant to be. It is a slow, often painful process. You face your shadow, you encounter your inner opposites, you confront illusions and leave behind borrowed identities. But in doing so, you begin to live with deeper meaning, stronger intuition, and inner alignment. Jung described individuation as the natural unfolding of the psyche, like a seed growing into a tree. You don't force it, you uncover it. And as you walk this path, you stop being divided within yourself, you become whole. Carl Jung introduced the concept of synchronicity to explain something many people experience, but few can explain. It's the feeling that a coincidence isn't just random, that it holds meaning. You think of someone and they call. You dream of a symbol and then see it the next day. You're struggling with a decision and the answer arrives through a song, a stranger, or a line in a book. Jung called this meaningful coincidence, and he believed it revealed a deeper layer of reality. Synchronicity occurs when an inner psychological state coincides with an outer event, but with no causal connection. They are not logically linked, yet they feel connected by purpose. To Jung, synchronicities were not just strange accidents. They were signs that your inner world and outer world were momentarily aligned. Moments where the unconscious breaks through, and reality seems to reflect the psyche. He believed that these events were more likely to happen during times of personal transformation, crisis, or deep introspection, when the psyche is reaching toward wholeness. Synchronicity suggests that we are not as separate from the world as we think, that psyche and matter may be connected, not through cause and effect, but through meaning. And if we pay attention, not with superstition, but with openness, synchronicity can act as a guide on the path of individuation. To Carl Jung, dreams were not random. They were not meaningless byproducts of the brain. He saw dreams as messages, direct communications from the unconscious mind. While Freud believed dreams were disguised wish fulfillments, Jung saw them differently. He believed dreams carried wisdom, not just about the past, but about your current psychological state, and sometimes even your future direction. Dreams use symbols, metaphors, and archetypes. They don't speak in logic or language, they speak in images. And those images reflect not only your personal life, but deeper forces within you, the same ones found in myths, legends, and spiritual traditions. Jung said that every dream serves a purpose: to compensate for your conscious attitude, to reveal something you've ignored, to guide you toward balance, healing, or growth. Even nightmares, to Jung, weren't threats. They were calls to attention, signals that something in your psyche needs to be seen. Jung encouraged people not to analyze dreams with rigid formulas. Instead, he believed in dialogue with the dream, through reflection, journaling, and what he called active imagination. By paying attention to your dreams, you begin to understand what the unconscious is trying to show you. And the more you listen, the more it speaks. Carl Jung used the term persona to describe the social mask you wear, the version of yourself you present to the world. It's not fake, but it's also not the full truth. The persona is shaped by your environment, your family, culture, job, and social expectations. It helps you function in society. It lets you play roles: friend, partner, worker, student, and adapt to what others expect from you. But problems begin when you mistake the persona for your whole identity. You start to believe that you are only what the world sees: polite, reliable, agreeable, or tough, distant, always in control. You hide what doesn't fit the image, your fears, doubts, and desires, and in doing so, you create a split between who you are and who you show. Jung didn't say the persona was bad, it's necessary. Without it, you'd be socially exposed, vulnerable, or overwhelmed. But if you become too attached to the persona, if you over-identify with it, it blocks your growth. You lose contact with your inner life. Individuation requires peeling back the mask, not to destroy it, but to see through it and rediscover what's behind it. Because the real self is not the mask, it's the one wearing it. One of Jung's major contributions to psychology was his theory of psychological types, beginning with the distinction between introversion and extroversion. These aren't just personality traits, they describe the direction of your psychic energy, where your focus naturally goes. An introvert turns inward. They draw energy from solitude, reflection, and the inner world of thoughts and feelings. They may enjoy social interaction, but too much of it drains them. An extrovert turns outward. They're energized by people, activity, and the external world. They prefer to act first, reflect later, and thrive in engagement and movement. Jung believed that everyone has both tendencies, but one is usually dominant. It's not about being shy or outgoing, it's about where your energy flows most naturally. This distinction was part of a broader system Jung developed, a framework for understanding how people perceive reality and make decisions. That system would later inspire the Myers-Briggs type indicator. But for Jung, the goal was never to put people in boxes. The real purpose of identifying your type is self-awareness, to understand your strengths, your blind spots, and the inner balance you may need to cultivate. Because growth often lies in the opposite function, the part of you that isn't natural, but is necessary. Carl Jung believed that we all experience the world through 4 primary psychological functions. 4 ways the mind gathers information and makes decisions. These functions are thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. Thinking is the function of logic and analysis. It asks, does this make sense? It values objectivity, clarity, and rational structure. Feeling, on the other hand, is not about emotion. It's about value. It asks, is this important to me? Does it feel right? Feeling evaluates based on meaning, ethics, and harmony. Then there is sensation, the most grounded function. It focuses on what is concrete, real, and present. It notices details, physical facts, and practical reality. And finally, intuition, the most abstract of the four. Intuition sees patterns, possibilities, and what could be. It connects the dots between unrelated ideas and often operates beneath conscious awareness. Each person tends to favor one dominant function. For example, someone might lead with thinking, while another leads with intuition. But for Jung, true psychological growth means becoming aware of all four and gradually developing the ones we've neglected. The functions are tools. The more balanced and conscious they become, the more complete our perception of life. In Jung's psychology, the self is not the same as the ego. The ego is just the conscious part of your identity, the I you think you are. But the self is much greater. The self is the totality of the psyche. It includes the conscious mind, the unconscious, the shadow, the anima or animus, the persona, everything. It is the full blueprint of who you are meant to become. You could think of the ego as a single room, while the self is the entire house. Jung believed that deep within each person, the self is constantly trying to express itself, guiding your dreams, pulling you toward balance, nudging you to grow. It's not always comfortable, because growth often means confronting what the ego wants to avoid, your fears, your blind spots, your false beliefs. But the self is not just a concept, it's a living inner center, an organizing force that pushes you toward wholeness, toward a life of authenticity and integration. In many spiritual traditions, this is known as the soul. In Jungian psychology, it is the self, the goal of individuation, and the source of your deepest meaning. When you align with the self, you no longer live just from the surface. You begin to live from the center. In Jung's model of the psyche, the ego is not the villain, but it's not the whole story either. The ego is the center of your conscious awareness. It's your sense of identity, the I that makes decisions, sets goals, reacts to the world, and forms opinions about who you are. Without the ego, you would have no sense of self. It gives you continuity. It lets you function in daily life. It's the part of you that says, "This is me." But it's important to understand the ego is not the total self. It's just one part of a much larger psychological system. When the ego thinks it is the whole, when it becomes inflated or disconnected from the unconscious, that's when problems begin. You become rigid, reactive, and cut off from the deeper intelligence of the psyche. Jung didn't want people to destroy the ego. He believed the ego must be strong enough to handle the work of individuation, but flexible enough to listen to the unconscious. A healthy ego doesn't dominate or collapse. It acts as a bridge, linking your conscious life with the deeper parts of your mind. It's not about ego death, it's about ego maturity. Jung believed that symbols are the true language of the unconscious. Unlike signs, which point to something specific and literal, symbols point to something deeper. They represent ideas, emotions, and inner realities that cannot be fully explained in words. A symbol might appear in a dream, a snake, a mountain, a door. It might arise in art, in mythology, or even in a powerful personal experience. And while you can try to interpret it, the power of a symbol comes not from being solved, but from being felt. Symbols are bridges between the conscious mind and the unconscious. They carry messages from deep within, messages your rational mind may not understand, but your intuition does. Jung believed that as you move through the process of individuation, the unconscious sends symbols to guide you, to warn you, to awaken you. That's why he saw religious images, myths, and archetypes as psychologically real, not just cultural artifacts, but reflections of something universal inside us. To Jung, symbols were sacred. They are how the soul communicates. If you learn to pay attention to them, in dreams, in feelings, in life itself, you begin to understand your inner world not just intellectually, but symbolically. And that's how transformation begins. Not every message from the unconscious comes through dreams. Some arrive when you're fully awake, through images, impulses, or inner voices that seem to emerge from somewhere beyond thought. Active imagination is a way of engaging those messages. Instead of ignoring them, you enter into dialogue. It begins by focusing on an image, maybe from a dream, or a powerful feeling, or even a sudden memory that won't let go. Rather than analyzing it or pushing it aside, you give it space. You let it speak. You might close your eyes and imagine a conversation with that figure or symbol. You might write it out. You might draw it, paint it, or simply allow the scene to unfold in your mind. It's not daydreaming. It's a conscious encounter with the unconscious, a bridge between two parts of the self. This technique brings unconscious content to light. It reveals inner conflicts, and it gives voice to the parts of you that don't usually get heard: the child, the critic, the shadow, the guide. With time, these inner figures become more familiar, less frightening, and more integrated into your conscious personality. Active imagination isn't about control, it's about relationship, a conversation between the surface and the depths. As you explore the unconscious, through dreams, symbols, active imagination, something begins to shift. You start to recognize parts of yourself you'd forgotten, emotions you've buried, instincts you've ignored, desires you've denied. And the more you bring these hidden aspects into awareness, the more whole you become. This is the process of integration, the gradual uniting of the fragmented pieces of the psyche. Integration doesn't mean fixing or erasing parts of yourself. It means making room for them. It means allowing contradiction, tension, and complexity without needing to simplify who you are. You integrate the shadow by acknowledging what you repress. You integrate the anima or animus by listening to your inner opposite. You integrate your dreams, projections, fears, and fantasies, not by rejecting them, but by understanding their place within your larger story. This is not a one-time event. It's a lifelong process, quiet, slow, often invisible on the surface. But each insight, each inner shift, brings a deeper sense of alignment. The goal isn't perfection, it's inner coherence. A life where the outer and inner worlds reflect one another, where your actions match your truth. Integration is how the unconscious becomes conscious, and that is where transformation begins. As you work to integrate the psyche, you may begin to feel something unexpected, that your personal struggles echo something much larger. They start to feel mythic. That's not by accident. Myths are not just old stories from forgotten cultures. They are psychological maps, symbolic narratives that reflect the deepest patterns of the human mind. Across history, people have told the same kinds of stories: the hero's journey, the descent into the underworld, the sacrifice, the transformation, the rebirth. These recurring themes speak not just to culture, but to the structure of the soul. Myths give form to what the unconscious knows but can't always say. They externalize what's happening within: your fears, your longings, your conflicts, your potential. That's why you're drawn to certain characters, certain symbols, certain kinds of stories. They aren't random. They resonate with your inner reality. When you feel lost, a myth may help you understand the stage you're in. When you feel stuck, it may offer a path forward. And when you feel broken, it reminds you that descent is often the beginning of renewal. You don't just read myths, you live them, in your own way, in your own time. And the more conscious you become of the myth you're inside, the more power you have to shape it. There's a paradox at the heart of transformation. The place where your deepest pain lies is often the place where your greatest healing begins. This is the idea behind the wounded healer. It's the insight that those who suffer, those who've been broken, hurt, rejected, or misunderstood, often carry the potential to help others heal. Not because they're perfect, not because they've overcome everything, but because they've faced the darkness and survived. The wound humbles the ego. It strips away illusion, and, if met consciously, it becomes a source of compassion, wisdom, and strength. In many myths and traditions, the healer is always marked by a wound, a visible or invisible scar that never fully goes away. But that very wound becomes the channel through which deeper understanding flows. You don't have to hide your pain to be whole. You don't have to be healed to be of service. Your vulnerability, when owned, not avoided, becomes a kind of medicine. The wounded healer reminds us that healing is not about erasing the past. It's about using what was broken to open the door for someone else. One of the most powerful and dangerous things the unconscious does is project. When you're unaware of something within yourself, a fear, a desire, a weakness, or even a strength, you may begin to see it in someone else. This is projection. You meet a person and instantly dislike them without any clear reason, or you fall in love with someone you barely know, convinced they're perfect. Often, you're not seeing the person, you're seeing your own unconscious material cast onto their surface. Projection is the mind's way of protecting the ego. It keeps you from facing what you're not ready to admit. But it also keeps you stuck, repeating patterns, misjudging people, and living in distortion. You might project your shadow onto others and label them as toxic, selfish, or dangerous, when in truth, you're avoiding those qualities in yourself. Or you might project your unlived potential, your courage, your creativity, your depth, onto someone you admire, never realizing it also belongs to you. Recognizing projection takes honesty. It's uncomfortable, it demands reflection, but it's also freeing, because every time you withdraw a projection, you reclaim a part of yourself. And the more you do that, the clearer your relationships become, with others and with who you truly are. There's a part of you you'd rather not see. The part that gets angry too easily, that judges, that envies, that fears failure or craves control. The part that doesn't fit the image you want to maintain. This is the shadow, and avoiding it only gives it more power. The shadow doesn't go away when you ignore it. It grows silently. It shows up in your reactions, your relationships, your self-sabotage. It lives in the emotions that flare up suddenly, and in the behaviors you can't fully explain. Facing the shadow means turning inward and choosing to see what's been hidden. It means owning your darkness, not to indulge it, but to understand it, because whatever you repress doesn't disappear. It controls you from below. But here's the truth. The shadow is not just the worst of you. It also contains your unclaimed power, your assertiveness, your independence, your creative fire, your raw truth. By facing it, you don't become less good, you become more whole. You stop being split between who you are and who you pretend to be. And in that space, you find clarity, depth, and a new kind of self-respect. The shadow you face becomes the strength you own. For most people, alchemy means turning lead into gold. But beneath the surface of that ancient science lies something far more symbolic, something deeply psychological. Alchemy, in this context, is a metaphor for inner transformation. The old alchemists weren't just working with metals. They were unknowingly documenting the stages of psychic change, the long, difficult process of turning the raw material of the self into something refined. Lead represents the unconscious self, heavy, unformed, full of shadow and instinct. Gold symbolizes psychological wholeness, a state of balance, integration, and inner clarity. The alchemical stages, nigredo, albedo, rubedo, mirror the stages of personal growth. Nigredo is the blackening, the breakdown, the dark night of the soul. Albedo is the whitening, the purification, the illumination of truth. Rubedo is the reddening, the final integration, where opposites unite and a new self is born. These weren't just mystical ideas. They describe something very real, the emotional and spiritual struggle of confronting the unconscious and forging a stronger, more authentic self. Transformation isn't clean or linear. It's messy, cyclical, demanding. But if you stay with it, what begins as lead eventually becomes gold. When you feel torn between two opposites, between reason and emotion, control and chaos, confidence and fear, it can feel like a stalemate, like no path forward exists. But within that inner tension lies something powerful, the transcendent function. This isn't a mental trick or a quick solution. It's the natural psychological mechanism that arises when you allow opposing forces to exist without forcing a choice. When you stop trying to suppress one side and instead let both speak. You hold the conflict. You stay with the discomfort. And then, unexpectedly, something new emerges. A third position, a creative insight, a symbol, a dream. Something you couldn't have predicted and couldn't have reached by logic alone. The transcendent function unites the conscious and unconscious mind. It's how growth happens, not by eliminating contradictions, but by transforming them. It requires patience. It asks you to tolerate ambiguity, to resist the urge to rush into premature certainty. But when it works, it produces deep clarity and a real inner shift. It's not about solving the conflict. It's about becoming someone who can contain it and allow something greater to form from within. Perfection is what the ego craves. It wants control, certainty, and approval. It wants to be right, admired, clean, finished. But the deeper self wants something else. It wants wholeness. Wholeness means including what's messy. It means making space for your contradictions, your doubts, your wounds, not to fix them, but to understand them. You weren't meant to become flawless. You were meant to become real. That means embracing your shadow, not hiding it. It means feeling pain and letting it teach you, not pretending it isn't there. It means seeing yourself clearly, the beautiful and the broken, and saying, this too belongs. The pursuit of perfection cuts you off from your depth, but wholeness reconnects you to it. In the process of individuation, this shift is essential. You stop trying to become someone ideal and start becoming someone true. Wholeness doesn't mean every part is equal. It means every part has a place. And that's where strength comes from. Not from being flawless, but from being fully integrated. One of the central dynamics in Jungian psychology is the presence of psychic opposites, light and shadow, reason and instinct, masculine and feminine, ego and unconscious. These oppositions are not meant to be eliminated. They exist naturally within the psyche, and growth depends on them. Jung observed that when opposing forces within the psyche clash, a tension is created. Rather than resolving it through repression or denial, the key is to hold that tension consciously. This inner conflict generates psychological energy. If you don't act on it impulsively or suppress it out of fear, a third possibility can emerge, something new that transcends both sides. This emergence is what Jung called the transcendent function in action. It's the bridge between opposites, a spontaneous restructuring of the psyche that leads to greater integration and individuation. Without this tension, there is no movement, no transformation, only rigidity. Jung made it clear, the path to wholeness is forged through these inner polarities. The goal is not to destroy them, but to contain them, to let the psyche evolve by confronting its contradictions directly. Jung saw the journey towards psychological wholeness as a heroic process, not in the mythic fantasy sense, but in a deeply personal inner confrontation with the unconscious. This journey begins with the ego, the conscious mind, being pulled into contact with the unconscious. That pull is often triggered by suffering, crisis, or a deep sense of dissatisfaction. At this point, the individual is forced to turn inward. In mythology, the hero leaves the familiar world, faces trials, and undergoes transformation. Jung recognized that these stories mirrored what happens in individuation. The individual must confront the shadow, engage with the anima or animus, and endure the chaos of inner conflict. This isn't about external battles. It's about confronting psychological contents that were previously unconscious. Jung emphasized that this is not a linear or comfortable process. It's often marked by disorientation, regression, and resistance. But these are necessary phases. Only by enduring them can the individual reach what Jung called the self, the totality of the psyche. This journey is not for the weak-willed. It demands honesty, endurance, and the willingness to suffer psychological death in order to be reborn into a more complete state of being. In Jungian terms, that's the true hero, not someone who conquers the world, but someone who integrates the psyche. The Red Book is not theory, it's experience. It documents a critical period in Jung's life, starting around 1913, when he broke away from Freud and descended into what he called a confrontation with the unconscious. Rather than suppress the intense visions, fantasies, and symbolic images that surfaced during this time, he engaged with them directly. He used a method later formalized as active imagination, recording dialogues, drawings, and symbolic narratives that emerged from his inner world. This process wasn't for display. It was private. Jung didn't publish the Red Book in his lifetime. He considered it a record of his personal individuation process. Inside it, you find the early emergence of many of his core ideas: the shadow, the anima, the self, the archetypes, and the role of myth and symbol in psychic transformation. Jung wasn't analyzing patients in these pages. He was analyzing himself. He once said that everything he later developed in his psychological system originated from this experience. The Red Book is proof that Jung didn't just theorize about the unconscious. He lived in it, dialogued with it, and let it reshape his psyche. It stands as a reminder: depth psychology isn't just about observation, it's about participation. In Jungian analysis, integration of the shadow is not optional. It's fundamental to healing and psychological maturity. The shadow contains everything the ego refuses to acknowledge: morally inferior impulses, socially unacceptable traits, but also untapped potential and vital instincts. Left unconscious, it remains split off, influencing your behavior from below, often through projection, self-sabotage, or irrational reactions. Integration doesn't mean indulging the shadow or acting it out. It means making it conscious, identifying it, owning it, and understanding its role in your psychic structure. This process typically begins with resistance. The ego doesn't want to see what it considers shameful or dangerous, but the longer you avoid it, the more power the shadow holds. Through methods like dream analysis, active imagination, and honest self-inquiry, you begin to retrieve these denied parts. You start to recognize your own capacity for traits you once only saw in others. Jung was clear: the shadow is not just darkness. It also contains energy, creativity, and authenticity. It's where much of your undeveloped personality is buried. True healing involves integration, not perfection. By facing your shadow consciously, you reduce its destructive grip and recover parts of yourself that were lost. Wholeness is only possible when nothing is left in the dark. One of Jung's key insights was that the unconscious doesn't simply reflect repressed content. It actively compensates for the imbalances in your conscious attitude. In other words, if your conscious mind becomes too one-sided, too rational, too rigid, too inflated, the unconscious will push back with material that reintroduces the neglected elements. This compensation often appears in dreams, where the content seems irrational or emotionally charged, but is actually serving to restore psychological balance. For example, if someone is overly identified with their intellect, the unconscious may confront them with dreams filled with raw emotion or instinct. If someone sees themselves as morally flawless, the unconscious might present images of aggression or sexuality, not as condemnation, but as correction. This isn't random, it's a form of psychic self-regulation. The unconscious does not want to destroy the ego, it wants to balance it. Jung saw this compensatory function as evidence that the psyche is not chaotic, but purposeful. When you ignore these compensations, the psyche escalates, first through dreams, then through symptoms, and eventually through crisis. Listening to the unconscious and interpreting it with honesty allows you to adjust your conscious attitude before it collapses into neurosis or fragmentation. It's not about control, it's about cooperation with the deeper intelligence of the psyche. Jung distinguished between two fundamental layers of the unconscious: the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious. The personal unconscious is made up of content that was once conscious but has been forgotten or repressed. This includes memories, emotional complexes, and experiences specific to your own life. It is unique to you. shaped by your biography, relationships, and environment. But beneath that lies the collective unconscious, a deeper, universal layer of the psyche that is not acquired but inherited. Unlike the personal unconscious, the collective unconscious contains archetypes, universal patterns, symbols, and structures that shape how every human thinks, feels, and dreams, regardless of culture or upbringing. Jung argued that this is why similar myths, symbols, and dream motifs appear across civilizations with no contact, because they emerge from the same psychic substrate. To clarify, the personal unconscious holds your forgotten experiences. The collective unconscious holds what humanity has always known but never learned. Understanding this distinction is critical. Many psychological issues are not just personal traumas. They're expressions of deeper archetypal dynamics that require symbolic insight, not just surface-level analysis. Jung's clinical work made it clear, to truly heal and individuate, you must work through both layers, the personal and the collective. Jung used the term numinous to describe experiences that are overwhelming, beyond rational comprehension, and charged with profound emotional power. These are moments where the psyche encounters something vast, something that feels sacred, terrifying, or awe-inspiring, but that cannot be reduced to logical explanation. The numinous experience is not a belief, it is an event, an eruption of the unconscious into consciousness. It might be triggered by a dream, a religious vision, a work of art, or a sudden, inexplicable sense of presence. It leaves the ego destabilized, aware that something greater is at work. Jung argued that encounters with the numinous are not pathological. In fact, they are essential for individuation. They signal contact with the self, the deeper, organizing center of the psyche that transcends the ego. However, these experiences must be integrated carefully. If the ego identifies with the numinous, it can become inflated. If it rejects it entirely, the psyche may fragment or fall into despair. The key is relationship, not control. You must approach the numinous with humility, not domination. For Jung, the numinous was proof that the psyche is not just a mechanism, it is a living, dynamic field of meaning. Psychological transformation is rarely initiated by ideas alone. It begins with something numinous, an encounter with what cannot be ignored. Synchronicity, as Jung defined it, is the meaningful coincidence of inner psychological states and external events without any causal connection. But beyond its psychological implications, Jung viewed synchronicity as having deep spiritual significance. He observed that synchronistic events often occur during periods of psychic crisis, transformation, or individuation, moments when the ego is under pressure and the unconscious is actively trying to bring about change. In these moments, the external world seems to mirror the internal world. A dream becomes literal, a thought materializes, a chance encounter offers precisely the message the psyche needs. To Jung, these were not accidents. They pointed to an underlying unity between psyche and matter, a concept he explored in collaboration with physicist Wolfgang Pauli. This challenged the rigid separation between the inner and outer world that defined modern science. Synchronicity suggested a third principle beyond causality and chance, one grounded in meaning. In spiritual development, this matters. Synchronicities can act as markers, signaling that the psyche is aligned with a deeper process, or that the self is drawing consciousness forward. However, Jung warned against superstition or inflated interpretation. The value of synchronicity lies in how it's integrated, not in chasing mystical signs. When taken seriously but not obsessively, synchronistic experiences support the individual's movement toward inner order and spiritual wholeness. Jung observed that rebirth is one of the most recurring and powerful symbols in mythology, religion, and dreams. But in Jungian psychology, rebirth is not about physical death or reincarnation. It's a psychological process, a symbolic expression of the ego being transformed through contact with the unconscious. Rebirth often follows a breakdown, the collapse of a previous identity, belief system, or ego structure. In dreams, this might appear as death, dismemberment, or descent into darkness. This is not pathological, it is archetypal. Rebirth follows what Jung referred to as the nigredo stage, the blackening found in alchemical symbolism, where old forms disintegrate. It is only after this dissolution that something new can emerge. The new self that is born is not fabricated, it is discovered. It reflects a deeper alignment with the self, the totality of the psyche. Jung emphasized that these symbols often appear when someone is ready, consciously or unconsciously, to leave behind outdated modes of being. Religious motifs of baptism, resurrection, or second birth mirror this internal psychological truth. The individual who integrates unconscious material does not return to who they were. They become someone more whole, more centered, and more real. Rebirth, in Jung's view, is not a miracle. It is the natural consequence of psychic integration. Among the many archetypes Jung identified in the collective unconscious, the trickster stands out for its paradoxical, chaotic nature. The trickster appears in mythology worldwide, as Loki in Norse myth, Hermes in Greek, Coyote in Native American stories, or the Fool in medieval courts. This figure is disruptive, irreverent, clever, and often amoral, constantly breaking rules, crossing boundaries, and revealing contradictions. Jung saw the trickster not as mere folklore, but as a psychic pattern. It emerges from the primitive layers of the collective unconscious, where instinct and impulse are still undifferentiated. Psychologically, the trickster represents what the ego cannot control, the irrational forces that undermine certainty, expose pretension, and dismantle inflated self-images. It often appears in dreams or projections when the psyche needs to be shaken, when rigidity, pride, or moral one-sidedness has taken hold. But the trickster isn't just destructive, it has a transformative function. By disrupting the status quo, it creates the space for something new to emerge. It humbles the ego, exposes unconscious content, and forces confrontation with the absurd and unresolved. Jung viewed the integration of the trickster archetype as crucial, not to become deceptive or chaotic, but to acknowledge the irrational aspects of the psyche rather than repress them. To ignore the trickster is to fall prey to your own self-deception. To recognize it is to step closer to psychological honesty and symbolic insight. The wise old man is one of the central archetypes that emerges from the collective unconscious, a symbol of deep inner guidance, insight, and mature wisdom. This figure appears throughout mythology and literature, Merlin in Arthurian legend, Gandalf in Tolkien's universe, or even Yoda in modern myth. In dreams and fantasies, he may appear as a teacher, hermit, magician, or spiritual father. Jung noted that this archetype often surfaces during the second half of life, a phase he called the afternoon of life, when the individual begins to turn inward and seek meaning beyond the ego's ambitions. Psychologically, the wise old man represents the self in its guiding function, the part of the psyche that offers orientation during periods of confusion, transition, or inner crisis. He often appears when the conscious ego has exhausted its strategies and begins to surrender to deeper truth. This archetype brings clarity not through logic, but through symbolic insight, paradox, or sudden intuitive knowing. But Jung also warned, the wise old man can be inflated or misused. If projected outward, the individual may become overly dependent on a guru or external authority figure. If mistaken for the ego itself, it leads to spiritual inflation, a delusion of superiority masked as wisdom. The task is to recognize this figure for what it is, an inner symbol, not a literal presence, and to integrate its guidance without surrendering discernment. Properly understood, the wise old man doesn't provide answers. He points inward, toward the greater self. The Great Mother is one of the most ancient and universal archetypes in the collective unconscious. She appears across mythologies as the earth goddess, the nurturing caretaker, the fertility figure, but also as the devouring, engulfing, or punishing mother. This archetype embodies a fundamental psychological polarity. On one side, she is life-giving, protective, and nurturing. On the other, she is destructive, possessive, and consuming. Jung emphasized that the Great Mother is not the literal mother. She is a symbolic force representing the totality of the maternal principle, both the personal and transpersonal aspects. In the psyche, she may be projected onto real women, especially mothers, lovers, or authority figures, often idealized or feared without rational basis. In dreams, she appears as the nurturing figure, the womb, the cave, the ocean, or as something overwhelming and inescapable. Jung saw the integration of this archetype as essential for both men and women. For men, it involves withdrawing projections and developing a conscious relationship to the feminine. For women, it includes differentiating from the archetypal mother complex to establish an autonomous identity. The Great Mother can be a source of grounding and healing, but if unconscious, she can paralyze the ego with regression, dependency, or emotional enmeshment. To integrate her is to reclaim the deep instinctual connection to life without being swallowed by it. She is not just a symbol of nurture, she is the total force of nature within the psyche. The Child Archetype represents more than innocence or vulnerability. For Jung, it symbolizes potential, the unfolding of the self in its earliest, purest form. This archetype appears in dreams, myths, and religious imagery as the divine child, the wounded child, or the miraculous birth, each carrying psychological significance. It often emerges during the individuation process, when the ego reconnects with forgotten or undeveloped aspects of the psyche. The child reflects the part of you that is uncorrupted by adaptation, social expectation, or repression, the core of your becoming. But it also carries tension. The child is fragile, dependent, and threatened by the world's demands. This duality, between innocence and powerlessness, is central to the archetype. In many myths, the divine child appears during periods of darkness or chaos, a signal that something new is being born within the psyche, something essential for wholeness. Jung noted that this figure often arises when the ego is exhausted or disoriented. The child appears as a symbol of renewal, a sign that the psyche is reorienting itself toward integration. However, if unconscious, the child archetype can lead to regression, to helplessness, emotional immaturity, or excessive nostalgia. The task is not to return to childhood, but to integrate the qualities the child represents: creativity, spontaneity, openness, and connection to the self. The child is the seed of the future, not who you once were, but who you are still becoming. Jung's concept of the shadow is often misunderstood as being solely negative, a container for rage, envy, aggression, and shame. But Jung emphasized a critical point. The shadow also contains unlived potential. He once wrote, "The shadow is 90% pure gold." What he meant is that alongside the socially unacceptable traits we repress, we also bury qualities that were discouraged, misunderstood, or feared. Strength, assertiveness, creativity, sexuality, independence, ambition, spontaneity. In many cases, these golden aspects were split off during childhood or early development because they didn't fit the image we were expected to maintain. As a result, individuals often project these very qualities onto others, admiring people who seem free, bold, or creative, while not realizing these traits are part of their own repressed shadow. Jung believed that the process of individuation requires reclaiming this gold. It doesn't mean acting out impulses blindly. It means consciously recognizing and integrating the disowned parts of the personality, even when they contradict your ego ideal. In analysis, this often becomes the turning point. People discover that what they feared most in themselves was not dangerous, it was powerful. It was exactly what they needed to grow. The shadow is not just darkness, it is everything you are that you have not yet become. Jung repeatedly warned against the danger of psychological simplification. The psyche is not mechanical, and human beings are not reducible to neat categories, dogmas, or rigid ideologies. In his view, the mature personality must learn to live with complexity, contradiction, and ambiguity, not by resolving them, but by holding the tension between them. The unconscious is full of opposites: love and hate, creation and destruction, strength and vulnerability. The ego instinctively wants to resolve this conflict by choosing sides, seeking moral certainty, intellectual clarity, or emotional consistency. But Jung taught that true psychological growth demands the opposite, tolerating uncertainty long enough for a deeper synthesis to emerge. He called this process the Transcendent Function, the psyche's innate capacity to unite opposites by allowing a third, previously unseen perspective to develop. Certainty often protects the ego, but at the cost of depth. People cling to rigid beliefs, labels, or identities, not because they are true, but because they are easier to manage than complexity. Yet without complexity, there is no individuation. There is only imitation, living someone else's truth, not your own. Jung believed that wholeness requires a willingness to suffer contradiction, to say, "I don't fully understand yet," to recognize that multiple truths can exist simultaneously, and that integration takes time. Certainty may offer comfort, but it is in complexity that the self unfolds. Jung made one thing absolutely clear: the psyche is real. He argued that modern people often treat thoughts, dreams, fantasies, and inner experiences as just mental, secondary to physical reality. But in Jung's framework, the psyche is not imaginary. It is not fiction. It is a living reality with structure, laws, and its own form of intelligence. He frequently said, "The psyche is real in its effects." If an idea, a dream, or an unconscious complex can alter your behavior, shape your identity, or affect your emotional and physical state, then it is real. Not materially, but psychologically. The failure to take the psyche seriously is what Jung saw as the spiritual disease of modernity. By reducing everything to biology, society, or logic, we disconnect from the symbolic, archetypal forces that animate our lives. He insisted that unconscious contents are not symbolic in a poetic sense, they are functional. A dream isn't just imagination, it's a communication from the unconscious. An archetype isn't a metaphor, it's a fundamental structuring principle of how humans perceive, behave, and relate. To Jung, healing and transformation are only possible when the psyche is treated with the same seriousness as the body, not as something to fix, but as something to understand. You don't have to believe in metaphysics to engage with the psyche. You just have to admit this truth. Your inner world has consequences. One of Jung's most important and unsettling realizations was that the unconscious is autonomous. It is not passive. It does not simply store forgotten memories or suppressed desires. It has its own intelligence, its own agenda, and at times it operates entirely independent of the ego. You don't choose your dreams. You don't choose your intrusive thoughts, complexes, or emotional reactions. They happen, and often they contradict your conscious values, plans, and self-image. Jung observed that the unconscious behaves like an inner subject. It presents opinions, criticisms, symbolic content, and sometimes even direct confrontations with the ego. In dream work and active imagination, these autonomous contents often appear as characters with their own voice, intention, and resistance. This is why Jung believed that dialogue with the unconscious was essential. It's not a matter of control, it's a matter of relationship. You can repress it, deny it, or fight it. But if ignored, the unconscious will assert itself through projection, neurosis, somatic symptoms, or fate-like patterns that repeat without explanation. Jung treated the unconscious with respect, not fear. He did not reduce it to primitive urges as Freud did. He saw it as a partner in the individuation process, one that must be heard, challenged, and integrated. To live unconsciously is to be possessed by what you refuse to face. To live in relationship with the unconscious is to begin the work of becoming whole. Jung devoted decades to the study of alchemy, not for its chemistry, but for its symbolic content, because he saw in it a perfect metaphor for psychological transformation. The ancient alchemists believed they were transforming base metals like lead into gold. But Jung realized that their symbols, drawings, and processes were not just physical, they were projections of inner psychic work. What they were actually documenting, unconsciously, was the process of individuation. The stages of alchemical transformation, nigredo, albedo, rubedo, correspond to phases of deep psychological change. Nigredo, the blackening, where the ego breaks down, often experienced as depression, chaos, or identity loss. Albedo, the whitening, where clarity, purification, and insight begin to emerge. Rubedo, the reddening, the final stage of integration and wholeness, the union of opposites, the realization of the self. Alchemy, in Jung's interpretation, is the symbolic language of the unconscious, especially during profound psychic shifts. Many of the images, the hermaphrodite, the vessel, the dragon, the phoenix, are archetypal and appear spontaneously in dreams or art when the psyche is undergoing deep inner work. Jung believed that when the outer religious framework collapsed, the psyche found other ways to express the need for transformation. Alchemy was one of those ways. To study it psychologically is to see that what the alchemists were really trying to do was heal the soul. Jung understood that genuine psychological transformation often begins not with elevation, but with descent. This descent is not a choice, it's a necessity, often triggered by depression, crisis, identity collapse, or a sudden confrontation with shadow material. In myths across cultures, the hero must descend into the underworld, not to escape, but to recover something essential. Jung believed this mythic structure reflects a deep psychic reality. The ego must go down, into the depths of the unconscious, to encounter what it has denied, repressed, or never fully known. This journey is marked by confusion, fear, and loss of control. The usual structures of meaning, career, persona, belief systems begin to dissolve. Jung described this phase as nigredo, or blackening, the first stage of alchemical transformation. It's in this darkness that the individual meets the shadow, engages with archetypal energies, and confronts inner chaos. But the descent is not regression, it is a search. Without facing the unconscious directly, you remain fragmented. The descent provides access to the raw, unfiltered content that must be integrated for wholeness to occur. Jung emphasized, this journey cannot be avoided without cost. Avoidance leads to stagnation, projection, and neurosis. But for those willing to endure it, the descent becomes the gateway to rebirth, not a return to the old self, but the emergence of a deeper, more authentic self, rooted in the totality of the psyche.